For over a decade, the snow-chain mountains had remained untouched by mortal footsteps. The winds howled, the snow fell without end and deep within the silent peaks. A mysterious expert cultivated in absolute seclusion. If you enjoy my way of explaining and storytelling, please consider supporting us through the donation. It really motivates us to keep creating. Han Li slowly rose to his feet. With a casual wave of his hand, a cloud of azure light drifted into existence before him, gradually condensing until it formed a glistening sphere about the size of an egg, almost solid in appearance. He gazed at the pure spiritual power swirling within his palm and murmured to himself, "Following the strengthening of my nascent soul, my magic power has grown proportionally as well." A moment later, he flicked his wrist, and the radiant sphere dissolved into scattered motes of light. He then slapped the top of his head. At once, a beam of azure qi shot upward and circled slowly above him. As the light faded, a tiny infant appeared in mid-air, its face identical to Han Li's. Originally, his nascent soul had stood only 2 inches tall. Now it had grown another half-inch, its form far more solid and clearly defined than before. The tiny figure held a small azure cauldron in its arms. Above its head hovered an emerald talisman and dozens of slender flying pins that orbited lazily in the air. The pins shimmered with a golden azure radiance, dazzling and almost ostentatious in their brilliance. Freed from the confines of its body, the nascent soul seemed delighted. It darted about the room with carefree joy, circling and gliding through the air for nearly 2 hours. Only when it seemed to grow weary did it finally drift back, sinking into Han Li's body once more. Han Li reopened his eyes, a faint smile of satisfaction appearing on his face. Before taking the nascent cultivating pill, his nascent soul could only remain outside his body for a single hour. Any longer than that would begin to sap its vitality. It was said that once a cultivator reached the late stage of deity transformation, the nascent soul would become completely solid, so stable that one could exist without a physical body, unafraid of even the fierce celestial winds. Such a state was also considered the most reliable path for a cultivator to ascend to the spirit realm. Yet despite the noticeable increase in his magic power, Han Li knew he was still far from the peak of the mid-nascent soul stage. Strangely enough, after refining the pill, a deep and inexplicable certainty had taken root in his heart. With 100 years of secluded cultivation, he felt utterly confident that he would reach that peak without encountering any bottlenecks along the way. The sensation was peculiar, but it filled Han Li with quiet delight. Once his nascent soul had fully settled back within him, Han Li opened his mouth and spat out 2 streaks of golden light. The streaks circled around him before gradually taking shape as 2 dim golden swords. They were the bamboo cloudswarm swords that the elder devil had seized during the battle at Devilfall Valley. Although their spiritual nature had not yet been completely erased, and thus they could still be controlled to a certain degree, they were no longer capable of forming the aureate sword formation. For that reason, Han Li had deliberately set aside time to restore them. At his mental command, the 2 swords floated forward and hovered about a meter in front of him. He opened his mouth once more, releasing 2 clouds of nascent flame that instantly engulfed the blades. Crackling azure fire danced along their surfaces. Han Li then flicked his sleeve, summoning several small bottles he had prepared in advance. Their stoppers popped open on their own, and streams of liquid and powder poured into the flames, staining the azure fire with shifting hues of crimson, violet, and gold. Han Li fixed his gaze on the swords with unwavering concentration. His fingers moved like flowing water as he cast seal after seal, guiding every step of the refinement process. The repair of the flying swords continued for 3 entire days. By the end of it, Han Li's complexion had turned deathly pale. With a deep breath, he spat out several drops of blood essence, merging them into the blades. Only then did the two swords regain their original brilliance. Their golden light shone once more pure and radiant, every trace of devilish chi completely purged. Han Li drew the swords back into his body and immediately entered meditation again. A full day passed. When Han Li finally opened his eyes, his magic power had fully recovered. With a flick of his hand, an emerald wooden ruler appeared in his grasp. It was the eight-spirit ruler. Han Li slowly traced the ruler's simple wood grain with his fingers, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Back inside the devil-subjugating pavilion, he had already discovered that ordinary spiritual power seemed to have little effect on the treasure. However, due to the urgency of the situation at the time, he had not been able to investigate further. Now, gripping the ruler in one hand, he began to slowly channel spiritual power into it. Azure light flowed from his fingertips and seeped into the wood. The result was exactly the same as before. Spiritual power circulated within the ruler. But aside from several faint lines of green light flickering across its surface, nothing changed. Even after pouring nearly a tenth of his total magic power into it, the ruler remained stubbornly inert. Han Li withdrew his power and lowered his head in contemplation. After a brief moment, he raised his other hand and extended a single finger. Rainbow-colored light flickered at the tip. From it emerged the Vajra barrier he had stored within his body. A thin thread of Buddhist light flashed from the barrier and slipped silently into the ruler. Instantly, the eight-spirit ruler trembled. Azure light pulsed from its surface, spilling outward as a thin mist. Within that mist, lines of emerald green characters began to appear, slowly forming a complete set of scriptures. Han Li's eyes widened in surprise as he focused his gaze. After reading for a moment longer, he let out a long sigh. So it was exactly as I expected. The eight-spirit ruler was indeed a Buddhist treasure. As he had suspected, it could only be controlled through Buddhist light. The scripture revealed within the mist was none other than the artifact imprint technique required to refine it. Han Li's primary cultivation art had always been Taoist in nature, supplemented by several powerful devilish techniques. The only Buddhist technique he had ever cultivated was the bright jade arts. Although it was an extremely high-level Buddhist technique, it focused primarily on tempering the body. Its practice involved painful purification processes that were notoriously difficult to endure. Since Han Li had only cultivated it to the second layer, he was incapable of generating true Buddhist light. However, the Vajra barrier contained an abundance of Buddhist energy, enough for him to cultivate at least the first layer of the artifact imprint technique. Han Li's thoughts raced like lightning. In an instant, he made his decision. Even if he could only wield a fraction of the ruler's true power, it would still be an incredibly formidable asset. With that in mind, he channeled even more Buddhist light into the ruler, causing the scripture of the artifact imprint technique to appear with greater clarity. Compared to the imprint method of the Heaven Void Cauldron, the technique for the eight-spirit ruler was quite different. Fortunately, it was not particularly difficult. With focused cultivation, it could likely be mastered within a year. Having reached that conclusion, Han Li flicked his sleeve and stored the ruler away in a flash of azure light. Then he turned his palm over and produced another object. It was the damaged Black Wind flag. The once formidable treasure had been reduced to tattered scraps of fabric, though most of the pole remained intact. Despite its ruined state, faint black light still shimmered across its surface, as if its spiritual essence had yet to fade. One could only imagine how terrifying the flag must have been in its prime. Han Li had no intention of repairing it. He had taken it out purely out of curiosity. Spatial treasures were exceedingly rare, even among divine spirit treasures. Compared to them, storage pouches were merely the lowest grade of spatial magic tools, offering little value for research. Unfortunately, divine spirit treasures were far beyond Han Li's current understanding. After several days of careful observation and experimentation, he was unable to glean even the slightest insight into the flag's mysteries. With a faint sigh of regret, he put it away. In its place, he summoned the massive flame cauldron he'd obtained from the Spirit Change Hall. Even before it had accidentally developed intelligence, it had already been a top-grade ancient treasure. Capable of releasing over 1,000 pure yang firebirds, it was by no means an object to be underestimated. Along with the cauldron, Han Li also took out several other items, a piece of nameless transparent material, 12 flame pillars and 3 black crystals of varying sizes. He knew they were rare treasures, but until now he had not had the leisure to properly examine them. As for the scroll from Kunwu Hall and the earthy yellow devil rod taken from Old Devil Qian's storage pouch, both possessed astonishing power. With only minimal refinement, he would be able to wield them freely. Unfortunately, the Bloodblade proved to be a disappointment. It had clearly been forged from a Devil Essence diamond. Han Li suspected it had been refined using one of the 2 pieces he had sold at the underground auction in the June capital. At its peak, the blade had grown terrifyingly powerful by devouring the flesh and souls of several nascent soul cultivators. But now all that accumulated power had vanished, leaving behind nothing more than an ordinary treasure. After pondering for a moment, Han Li realized the reason. The blade could temporarily increase its power by consuming blood and flesh, but it lacked the ability to store that power permanently. Over time, the borrowed strength would inevitably dissipate. After all, it was merely a replica. It could never compare to the true Devil Dragon blade. With clear disappointment, Han Li put the blade away. He lowered his head in thought for a moment before suddenly slapping the back of his head. A sphere of golden chi flew from his mouth. It was the Vajra barrier. Within the golden sphere floated 5 clusters of dazzling golden light. Han Li stared at it with a grave expression, a trace of hesitation flickering in his eyes. After a moment of consideration, he suddenly raised his head and pointed at the barrier. The sphere trembled violently and began to expand. Thunder roared. Countless arcs of lightning crackled through the air. As the light faded, 5 human skeletons emerged within the barrier. Each skeleton was covered in layers of talismans. Embedded within the pit of each ribcage was an additional jet-black skull, also sealed with talismans that prevented the slightest movement. These were none other than Old Devil Qian's Unbreakable Cinque devils. Han Li let out a soft sigh and muttered to himself, "The Cinque devils each possess the cultivation of an early nascent soul cultivator. Through devil refinement, the 5 devils are fused as one and are especially proficient in joint devilish techniques. Together they could even rival a late nascent soul cultivator. If I could somehow claim them as my own, they would undoubtedly become a tremendous asset. But they are vicious and unruly creatures. They once even turned against their own master. I fear the risk may be too great." With a flick of his hand, he slapped his storage pouch and summoned a black jade slip into his palm. Paying no further attention to the Cinque devils, he immersed his spiritual sense into the slip. The divine devil-bane lightning that had once restrained the devils had long since dissipated. However, the prolonged imprisonment within the Vajra barrier, combined with the countless restraining talismans plastered across their bodies, had rendered them utterly powerless. For the moment, the ferocious beings appeared strangely subdued, as though their violent nature had faded away. Not long after, Han Li withdrew his spiritual sense from the jade slip. He slowly raised his head, fixing the Cinque devils with an unwavering gaze. The black jade slip contained a nameless devil scripture, that Han Li had obtained from Old Devil Qian's storage pouch. Though incomplete, it recorded numerous sinister secret techniques, including the method used to refine the Unbreakable Cinque devils. According to the scripture, the refinement process required the fresh corpses of 5 nascent soul cultivators. The nascent souls of these cultivators must already have perished, leaving behind nothing but lingering resentment and hatred. Afterward, the corpses were refined with a variety of rare materials before being buried in a place rich with concentrated yin qi. Each month, a yin cultivator would be beheaded at that location, and the corpses would be nourished with their blood, flesh and soul. After a full 100 years of such gruesome cultivation, the 5 devil corpses would awaken with sentience. Even then, they would only be in their initial stage. Only after several more decades of further refinement through special secret techniques would the Cinque devils finally reach maturity. Yet even at that point, their cultivation would merely reach the core formation stage. To raise their strength any further required extraordinary effort and an enormous expenditure of resources. Even so, it should have been impossible for the 5 corpses to surpass the late core formation stage. And yet Old Devil Qian had been a heaven-shaking genius. Through some unknown method, he had managed to elevate the Cinque devils all the way to the early nascent soul stage. It was very likely that this drastic improvement was precisely what caused the devils to eventually turn on him. If the devil heads had only possessed core formation level strength, controlling them would have posed little difficulty. According to the scripture's refinement method, Han Li could theoretically gain control of the Cinque devils, even though he had not been the one to cultivate them from the beginning. Fortunately, the scripture also recorded a devil control technique specifically designed for them. By imposing several powerful restrictions upon each devil and periodically feeding them with his own blood essence, Han Li could forcibly maintain control. Naturally, this method was far inferior to Old Devil Qian's technique. Old Devil Qian had used the Cinque devils as incarnations of himself, allowing his nascent soul to inhabit their bodies. For Han Li, such a feat was impossible. His nascent soul could never safely enter their bodies. Furthermore, the risk of backlash would be far greater. At any moment of weakness, should he lose control of the devils or fail to supply them with blood essence, they would undoubtedly attempt to devour him without hesitation. Yet the method did possess one advantage. Since the devils would not be housed within his nascent soul, even if they rebelled, Han Li could simply escape rather than being forced to fight them directly. After weighing the risks and benefits, Han Li ultimately decided the reward was worth the danger. The Cinque devils were simply too valuable to abandon. With a flick of his fingers, Han Li struck several spell seals toward the devils. Each seal vanished into their bodies without a trace. Moments later, a sphere of blood slowly emerged from his mouth. Han Li's complexion immediately turned pale. The sphere contained an enormous amount of his blood essence. Without pausing to rest, he waved his hand. The blood sphere flashed with crimson light before splitting into 5 identical spheres. With another sweep of his sleeve, the 5 spheres shot toward the Cinque devils. Under Han Li's control, they blurred into streaks of red light, passing through the Vajra barrier and drifting toward the skeletons. As the blood spheres approached the black skulls, the true cores of the devils, the empty eye sockets suddenly ignited. With eerie green flames, the skulls began trembling violently as if overcome with excitement. Yet the moment they attempted to move toward the skeletons covered in talismans, flashes of green light erupted from the restraints repelling them. The resistance only seemed to provoke them further. A harsh clacking echoed through the room as the skulls gnawed their teeth relentlessly. A cold glint flashed across Han Li's eyes. With a flick of his sleeve, 5 small golden swords shot forth and hovered above the skulls. In the next instant, the swords plunged downward, pinning themselves firmly between the skulls' teeth and immobilizing them completely. The skulls howled wildly as the green flames in their eye sockets surged violently. Hanlai remained expressionless. He formed an incantation gesture with both hands. A thunderous crack split the air. Golden lightning erupted from the 5 small swords. Thin arcs of lightning danced across the skulls, causing them to tremble violently. Their savage howls quickly turned into pitiful wails as their ferocity diminished. Seeing this, Han Li finally allowed a faint smile to appear. The 5 blood spheres slowly descended into the mouths of the skulls. The green flames within their eye sockets flared brilliantly. In an instant, much of their lost vitality seemed to return. Han Li closed his eyes. His hands formed a strange incantation seal as he slowly released his spiritual sense. Guided by the power of his blood essence, a faint mental link gradually formed between him and the Cinque devils. Just as he had anticipated, the devils became noticeably calmer. The violent aura surrounding them faded considerably. Han Li let out a long breath of relief. He reached into his storage pouch and produced 5 sparkling silver needles. With a flick of his hand, 5 slender silver threads shot silently into the skulls. He then murmured another incantation and spat out 5 clouds of azure qi. The azure qi swirled and fluctuated as the incantation continued. Gradually, each cloud condensed into a small, faceless humanoid figure. Once the figures were fully formed, Han Li abruptly stopped chanting. He paused briefly before shouting. With a sharp motion of his hand, he drew 5 strands of yellow earth qi from the ground. The strands violently fused with the small bodies, transforming them into 5 lifelike yellow snakes. "Awaken," Han Li commanded. The 5 snakes blurred into motion, shooting forward and burrowing directly into the skulls. Without pause, Han Li retrieved a pile of silver rings from his storage pouch. These rings were a devil-restraining magic tool recorded in Old Devil Qian's scriptures, something Han Li had refined while traveling. Because he had incorporated remnants of his precious Tailstar essence during the refinement, the rings were extraordinarily durable. With a wave of his hand, more than 20 silver rings flew into the air. They emitted a strange chiming sound before vanishing from sight. In the next moment, they reappeared around the necks and limbs of the skeletons. Then, just as mysteriously, they faded away once more, becoming completely invisible. Only after completing all of this did Han Li finally release a long sigh. He waved his hand again. The Vajra barrier rapidly shrank before falling back into his palm. Strangely enough, both the skeletons and the black skulls of the Cinque devils had already dropped out of the barrier and landed on the ground. As the 5 golden swords withdrew from the skulls, the talismans covering their bodies suddenly burst into devilish flames and burned away. Freed from their restraints, the skulls transformed into clouds of grey qi and surged into the skeletons, disappearing within them. Han Li immediately activated the devil control technique recorded in Old Devil Qian's jade slip. Under his command, the Cinque devils slowly rose to their feet and floated toward him. With another command, the skeletons halted. Yet the green flames in their eye sockets flickered restlessly, as if they still longed to move closer. Han Li's expression darkened. He suddenly began chanting another incantation. 5 silver bands abruptly manifested around the skeletons. Azure flames burst from their surfaces. A scorched scent filled the air as the Cinque devils recoiled in terror, emitting strange squeaking sounds as they scrambled backward. The moment Han Li stopped chanting, the azure flames vanished instantly. The vicious devils had finally learned obedience. Han Li nodded inwardly with satisfaction. As long as he could command them to attack his enemies, it did not matter if he could not control them with perfect precision. With that thought, he activated the devil control technique once more. The 5 skeletons rapidly shrank before dissolving into 5 clouds of grey qi. Han Li flipped his hand, producing a small black bottle. The 5 clouds circled briefly before flying into the bottle, one after another. Once the last cloud entered, Han Li immediately sealed the bottle and attached several talismans for good measure. Only then did he carefully return it to his storage pouch. As long as he periodically fed them with blood, essence controlling them should not pose a problem. Of course, this method was only possible because Han Li possessed an abundance of vitality-restoring medicinal pills. Even cultivators with higher cultivation than his would rarely dare to sustain devils in such a manner. After all, blood essence was the foundation of one's vitality. Under normal circumstances, it could not be drained continuously. Even the creator of this devil control technique had only dared to develop it because he was also a grandmaster of pill. Refinement. Only someone capable of constantly replenishing their blood essence could afford such a reckless method. With the Cinque devils finally subdued, Han Li felt a sense of accomplishment. Yet there was still one more important matter awaiting his attention. The great yin true flame he had obtained from the ancient cauldron at Kunwu Mountain would surely become an invaluable weapon in battle. However, refining and mastering it would require considerable time. For now, Han Li decided to postpone that task until later. For more than 10 years, the snow chain mountains had been shrouded in an unbroken silence of cold. Everyone in the surrounding regions knew that a tremendously powerful expert was cultivating somewhere within the mountains. Naturally, no one dared venture anywhere near the area, and the entire mountain range remained undisturbed. When the nearby factions eventually realized that this mysterious expert merely sought a quiet place to cultivate and had no intention of interfering with anything else, they finally breathed a sigh of relief. One day, however, a violent snowstorm swept across the snow chain mountains. Ferocious winds howled through the valleys, hurling snowflakes as large as dandelions through the air. Within moments, the storm swallowed the mountains whole, blanketing the entire range beneath a thick layer of white nearly a foot deep. Even in such a frigid climate, a storm of this magnitude was rare. Most low-grade cultivators would never dare brave such weather. Yet amidst the raging blizzard, a dazzling streak of azure light suddenly tore across the sky before vanishing into the storm without a trace. 2 hours later, that same streak of azure light reappeared tens of thousands of kilometers away, near a distant mountain range far removed from the snow chain mountains. The light slowly faded. Han Li emerged from within it. After cultivating in seclusion for more than 10 years, he had finally finished refining all of his treasures. He had even absorbed the great yin true flame into his body, successfully completing the first stage of its cultivation. With all of his preparations complete, very little in this world could threaten him, unless he were attacked simultaneously by several late nascent soul cultivators or confronted by a terrifying existence. On the level of the devil ancestor xianxia, he had little reason to fear. Compared to when he had first entered Kunwu Mountain, both his cultivation and abilities had grown tremendously. Combined with the newly acquired treasures and the formidable Cinque devils, Han Li now possessed the confidence to stand his ground even against several late nascent soul cultivators at once. After so many years had passed, he estimated that the turmoil surrounding Kunwu Mountain had likely settled down. Thus, he decided it was finally time to travel to his next destination, North Night Island. Half a month later, cultivators passing near the snow chain mountains would discover that the dense white mist that had blanketed the region for years had suddenly disappeared. The mountains had become completely uninhabited, and once word spread that an unclaimed spirit vein had suddenly appeared, the nearby factions quickly descended into bitter conflict. War soon erupted among them. North Night Island was in truth a massive peninsula located a prefecture away from the Shuang region. The temperatures here were so extreme that even low-grade cultivators dared not venture outside without protection. Rather than being surrounded by water like a typical peninsula, North Night Island was encircled by endless sheets of frozen ice, with colossal glaciers rising between them like silent fortresses. The island stretched for hundreds of thousands of kilometers. At its northernmost edge stood a vast city of ice. This was North Night Palace, the greatest sect in the entire northern region. In truth, the sect's strength was no weaker than the top 10 righteous and devilish sects of the great Jin Empire. However, because North Night Island lay in what the mainland sects considered remote wilderness, they refused to acknowledge the palace as part of Great Jin's orthodox cultivation world. Instead, they regarded it as an overseas sect and excluded it from the empire's official rankings. Yet, in the sparsely populated northern regions of Great Jin, the fame of North Night Palace far surpassed even the mainland's greatest sects, the Heavenly Devil sect and the High Zenith sect. There was no doubt that it was the undisputed ruler of the north. Among cultivators of the region, it was also known by another name, the North Immortal Palace. Countless wandering cultivators dreamed of entering its gates. North Night Palace itself was divided into two major divisions, the Inner Palace and the Outer Palace. The disciples of the Inner Palace were selected from several powerful cultivator clans native to the region. The Outer Palace, however, recruited disciples from smaller clans and wandering cultivators who came from beyond the peninsula. Of course, if an Outer Palace disciple demonstrated exceptional talent or rendered great contributions, they could eventually be promoted into the Inner Palace. But those lacking talent yet still wishing to enter the Outer Palace faced a far harsher trial. They had to cross the thousands of kilometers of frozen wasteland that surrounded North Night Palace on foot. Due to the powerful restrictions placed across the region, low-grade cultivators were unable to fly. They could only rely on their own cultivation and techniques to withstand the bone-freezing cold as they trekked through the endless frost. Anyone who successfully reached the palace gates under such conditions would automatically be admitted into the Outer Palace. No matter how they survived the brutal journey, the mere act of reaching the palace proved they possessed at least some redeeming qualities. Naturally, very few succeeded. Many simply froze to death along the way. And yet, for the sake of pursuing the path of cultivation, wandering cultivators continued to throw themselves toward the trial like moths rushing into flame. One day, thousands of kilometers away from North Night Palace, a small group struggled through a raging snowstorm. There were more than 10 figures each, wrapped in thick fur cloaks. Their bodies glimmered faintly with spiritual light as they trudged forward step by step through the blizzard. They had already been traveling through the frozen wasteland for more than half a month. Their faces were pale as death, and their footsteps had grown increasingly unsteady. Yet none of them dared stop to rest. The cold simply would not allow it. They could only force themselves onward, sustaining their strength with spirit stones and whatever spiritual power they could muster. Among them, however, one traveler appeared particularly miserable. His breathing had grown ragged and exhaustion filled his face. After hesitating for a moment, he clenched his teeth and pulled a medicine bottle from within his robes. He swallowed a scarlet pill, and soon a faint flush returned to his pale complexion. Walking at the front of the group was a middle-aged man surrounded by a deep yellow light barrier. Without even turning his head, he calmly said, "Fellow Taoist Gu, How many yang fire pills do you still have left? If you cannot take them regularly, I'm afraid reaching North Night Palace will be difficult. The hailstorms ahead will likely be several times harsher than the one we just endured. The cultivator who had taken the pill appeared to be a youth in his 20s. Forcing a smile, he replied nervously, "Brother Gu, please don't worry. I still have an entire bottle in reserve. I'll definitely make it through." His tone carried a trace of fear toward the middle-aged man. "That's good," the middle-aged man said indifferently. "I have no interest in traveling with someone who has no chance of surviving." Satisfied with the response, the yellow light around his body flickered as he continued walking forward. The others quickly followed. It was as though staying close to this man represented their only chance of reaching North Night Palace alive. After taking only a few steps forward, however, the middle-aged man suddenly let out a startled cry. His footsteps halted instantly. He slowly raised his head and looked toward the sky. The others followed his gaze. There, amidst the raging blizzard, they saw a faint azure silhouette floating in the air. Strangely enough, an invisible force surrounded the figure, pushing the violent snowstorm back nearly 10 meters in every direction. The middle-aged man must have possessed unusually sharp senses to notice the person first. All the cultivators present felt their hearts tighten. Even core formation cultivators should have been affected by the region's flight restrictions. Yet this person floated effortlessly through the air. Could it be a legendary nascent soul cultivator? Or perhaps a high-ranking expert from North Night Palace? But the person's clothing looked unfamiliar. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Apprehension filled their hearts. "You are wandering cultivators seeking to enter North Night Palace." The azure figure finally spoke. The voice sounded young. Though the middle-aged man's cultivation was not particularly high, he was experienced and quick-witted. The moment he heard the question, he immediately cupped his fists and bowed deeply. "This junior's name is Gu Tiank," he said respectfully. "I am indeed one of those undergoing the trial to join the palace. Does Senior have any commands for us?" His expression was one of utmost reverence. The azure figure replied calmly, "You're quite perceptive. I don't have any commands in particular. It's just that this land is rather strange. I cannot seem to determine the correct direction forward. Since you appear confident in your path, do you possess some method of guidance?" Upon hearing this, Gu Tiank relaxed slightly. Still, he hurriedly answered, "It seems this is Senior's first time visiting North Night Island. The other areas of the island are easy enough to navigate, but this region lies within the influence of the palace's grand formation. The formation uses the renowned mythic serpent stone as its core, causing a cultivator's spiritual sense to constantly shift in different directions. Even if someone believes they are flying straight ahead, they may never actually reach the palace. As for juniors like us, we purchase soul-stabilizing medallions from the market at the island's entrance. With these magic tools, our sense of direction remains stable." The azure figure paused slightly. "A soul-stabilizing medallion?" "Yes," Gu Tiank replied quickly. "Although it isn't a rare magic tool, it is necessary to reach the palace safely. The medallions are sold by a shop affiliated with North Night Palace. Furthermore, only 30 are sold each year, and they lose their effectiveness once the year passes. To be safe, I purchased an extra medallion." He hesitated briefly before taking a yellow plate from his sleeve. "If Senior wishes, I can offer this spare medallion to you." Holding it respectfully with both hands, he extended it forward. The azure silhouette stroked his chin thoughtfully before letting out a small chuckle. Without the slightest hesitation, he reached out his hand. In a flash of yellow light, the medallion flew into his palm. Naturally, the azure silhouette was Han Li, who had reached North Night Island after roughly a month of travel. Originally, he had believed he could easily bypass the sect's restrictions with his abilities. Yet after arriving near the palace, he discovered to his surprise and irritation that his spiritual sense had become strangely disoriented. For a time, he had been completely unable to locate the palace. Since he had come to pay a friendly visit, it would be inappropriate to simply break through the formation by force. Thus, while considering his options, he happened to encounter this group of wandering cultivators. If you loved this story, please consider supporting us through the donation link below. Your support allows us to keep bringing you the best and most immersive video. We truly appreciate you being here with us.